Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Daniele Tavani, and I'm a professor in the Department of Economics at Colorado State University. I have the honor and pleasure of introducing Dr. Josh Bivens, Director of Research at the Economic Policy Institute, in this joint webinar co-sponsored by the Center for Peace and Development at the University of Oklahoma, Security and Context at Hampshire College, and the Department of Economics at Colorado State University. Dr. Bivens' research covers macroeconomics, fiscal and monetary policy, globalization, social security, and public investment. He is a leading policy analyst and frequently appears in the media and provides expert testimony in Congress. He has published or edited numerous books, including The State of Work in America, which is EPI's flagship publication, and it's now in its 12th edition. If this wasn't impressive enough, he also maintains an interest in academic publishing, an example of which is his important 2013 paper on corporate executive pay that he wrote with Larry Michel, and it appears in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. So since we don't have a lot of time, I will turn it over to Dr. Bivens in a few seconds. So I would encourage folks to use the Q&A feature to ask questions during the presentation. I will then monitor the Q&A and pass the questions to Josh. Over to you, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the organizers, everyone who's shown up. I'll try to move through my prepared presentation relatively quickly so we can have some good time for discussion. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. Okay, so this is a paper I co-authored with Larry Michel, and it's mostly a work of sort of literature review, but it's basically trying to gather all the evidence that we have sort of gathered ourselves or seen in other papers over the years, trying to provide a convincing story for why wage growth for the vast majority of American workers, basically the bottom 80%, has been so anemic over almost like the past generation of economic life. And we have found sort of what used to be kind of the conventional wisdom explanation for that slow wage growth, which seemed to be like competitive labor markets that are being affected by the sort of apolitical forces of technological change and sort of inevitable globalization, just to not fit the evidence that well. And so we wanted to see if we could actually explain a good portion of sort of wage inequality, which we'll define the metric we're using in a second, with other factors. And the sort of common root of those factors is policy changes over the past generation that have intentionally sought to weaken the bargaining position of the vast majority of American workers when they bargain for wage growth with their employers. And so that's sort of the background of this. And so let's just sort of get started. And first, I'll just note that this is sort of a project inspired by a larger effort that Larry undertook called the Unequal Bargaining Power Project, which is sort of a multidisciplinary look at the issue of bargaining power in labor markets and how it influences sort of all aspects of policymaking. We've commissioned a number of papers from not just economists, but political scientists, philosophers, legal theorists. And so it was all sort of kicked off by a dissent in a Supreme Court case written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And we think this quote from her just really sort of sums up insight that was once pretty prevalent in labor economics, but has been since lost, which is basically that for an individual employee bargaining with an employer, it is just a fundamentally unequal power relationship. And to make policy based on the premise that, in fact, it's a completely consensual level playing field would lead you to lots of mistakes. So I would urge people to check out the Unequal Power Project as well. But overview of this paper, and so we can get started. There's been a long policy debate on the sources of the rise in inequality in the US economy over the past sort of, again, call it 3 to 4 decades. Our claims in this paper are basically the following. One, most of the rise in inequality we've seen over the past generation really has its roots in the labor market. Basically, the rise of inequality stemming from these labor market outcomes are really poorly explained by any model that relies on the labor market being a competitive market, just affected by sort of, well-defined or shifts in well-behaved labor demand and supply curves. Instead, we argue the rise in inequality coming from the labor market is really about the redistribution of power within labor markets, and essentially leading to a redistribution of economic rents, which basically means, big changes in income that do not affect allocative efficiency within the labor market. So basically saying there is no competitive labor market that both determines wages and also leads to an efficient allocation of workers to jobs. Instead, there's just lots of rents caused by market power all over the place, and where they end up is mostly a function of the policy environment. And then in this paper, we basically claim that if you take the best estimates of the impact of very discrete identifiable policy changes, these add up to enough to near fully explain the rise in inequality within the labor market that we've seen. And there's very little left over that even needs to be explained by, looking at something like, competitive labor market models. Basically, what we think this shows is that sort of wage growth, the pace of wage growth and the level of wages in the economy is very much a political variable, influenced deeply by the policy regime. And then finally, I'll end, as I said before, this is mostly a work of literature review and synthesis. Some of the estimates and numbers I'll show you are sort of original ones done by us, but mostly this is collecting lots of research that's been done and trying to synthesize it in a way that, makes it all comparable. So that when we can start adding up to see if we can come up with a measure of the heft of policy changes in determining sort of the rise in inequality. And I'm just going to say two things to start to make this not just to potentially make it more relevant to some of the policy debates going on today, but because I actually believe it's like one reason why we did this research is we think if you have the wrong view of labor markets and what determines wage growth in mind, you're going to make policy errors sort of all over the place, including macroeconomic policy errors. And I'm just pointing to this speech given at Jackson Hole in 2018 by Alan Kruger that really should get a lot more attention. It was just an absolutely fantastic speech and set of remarks and argument. And basically, he was sort of echoing our view that erosions in workers' bargaining power are a very large determinant of wage growth and explain a lot. At the time, the thing to be explained was, why is wage growth for most workers so weak in 2018, even with unemployment at 4% or below? And so basically what he says is, there have been fundamental changes in bargaining power in US labor markets, and these are things that even central bankers need to keep their eye on because it should change how they assess the various risks in front of them when they're setting monetary policy. And in particular, he basically made the claim that if you have really weak bargaining power, you can have more accommodative monetary policy without worrying as much that you're going to sort of unleash some sort of, he didn't quite say it like this, I will say it like this, without being worried about unleashing sort of a wage price spiral. And just to give a sense of this in terms of the relevance to today's debates, we've had clearly a pretty rapid run-up in inflation over the past, say, 6 to 7 months in the US economy, and there's lots of pressure on the Federal Reserve to react pretty strongly to it. And one of the things you might want to know about how strongly you should react to a given inflationary shock is whether or not that shock is going to be amplified or dampened in the labor market. And I've got two time periods here. One is 1973 to 1979. One is basically the last year. And basically, I'm going to argue that the earlier period is the one people know about, where what began as a shock to the price of oil became amplified in the labor market. And you can sort of see that. And so this is a measure of inflation, price growth in the non-financial corporate sector, and unit labor costs, how much sort of wages started to amplify the inflationary shock. And you see on average over those 6 years, prices rose 7.0%. Unit labor costs actually rose faster than that, 7.4%. This is a case where developments in the labor market were actually amplifying an initial inflationary shock. Over the past year, you've seen almost the exact opposite. You've seen almost the exact same inflationary shock on the price side. The shock now is not, oil's part of it, but I think it's mostly broadly COVID, the shutdown and restart of the economy. Price growth is up 7% since the end of 2020. Unit labor costs are up less than a fifth as much. And so this is a case where the labor market is dampening, not amplifying the initial inflationary shock. And I think a big reason for the difference in these two things is the difference in the sort of institutional policy environment feeding through to an erosion of bargaining power. And that's why you've seen unit labor costs so far being such a heavy dampener, not an amplifier of inflationary shock. So just a sort of introductory remark for why this might be relevant to today's policy debates. And again, if there's questions of clarification, I am happy to take them along the way. I'm going to be a little too focused on the PowerPoint, so someone alert me if there's one that I should address. I'd say the first thing we try to explain, or this, the main thing we try to explain in our paper is basically this. It is the growing divergence between economy-wide productivity and a typical worker's compensation that has appeared basically starting in the late 1970s. And so what we have here is the dark blue line is a measure of economy-wide productivity. It's basically a measure of how much income is generated in an average hour of work in the economy. When I say income, it's not just wages. There's also profits generated in that hour of work and other income streams. But it's basically productivity growth is kind of the ceiling on how high or how fast average living standards can rise. And then the light blue line is a measure of real hourly compensation, including benefits, not just wages, but also health insurance benefits, pension benefits, of production and non-supervisory workers in the US economy, a group that is about the bottom 80% roughly of the US labor force. And you can see for most of the sort of 3.5 decades following World War II, these two measures tracked each other quite closely. A given increment of productivity growth saw almost the exact same increment of growth in real hourly compensation. And then you see a really, steep and growing wedge introduced between these two series since then. And basically, we would argue by about 2018, there's about a 41, 42 percentage point wedge in between these two series that to us is the thing that needs to be explained. Like, why is it that wages for the vast majority of American workers once kept pace with economy-wide productivity growth, and over the past 35 years have increasingly fallen behind? Can we explain this? And yeah, talking about the sort of technicalities of this figure could probably take an entire session. I'm happy to answer any questions about it, but I'm very confident this figure is very good in isolating only the wedge between these two series that is the result of rising inequality. Price deflators are the same across these two series. We account for depreciation, sort of, dot the I's, cross the T's. We think this is a very good measure of the strict effect of rising inequality in driving a wedge between these two series. So in terms of that wedge, basically productivity is income generated in an average hour of work. Real hourly compensation is workers' compensation. So the wedge between those two things is increasing income economy-wide that does not show up in the paychecks of the bottom 80% of workers, when at one time it used to show up in those paychecks. So it's, where did that income go? If it's not showing up in the paychecks of the vast majority, where is it going? Mostly it went here. And by here, it basically means really high-end wage earners. Basically, there's been a very large redistribution within the overall wage bill, away from that bottom 80% to the top 10, 5, and even at most extreme at the 1%. And so this is a measure of real average hourly earnings by wage group and how much they've grown since 1979. And you see the bottom 90% have seen cumulative growth of 26% over that 40-year period. That's the bottom light blue line. You see the top 1% has seen growth of about 160% over that same time period. The top 0.1%, we can't even fit it on the graph. They've risen at 350%. And so this has been this big redistribution within the wage bill that explains a good chunk of the that missing income from the pay productivity graph. A little bit of that missing income has gone, it's taken the form of a shift from wages overall to corporate profits. And so this is basically the labor share of corporate sector income over time. And basically you see until, between 1979 and 2000, there's not a big trend there at all. It's just very cyclical, it goes up and down depending on the state of the business cycle. Since 2000, each business cycle peak has so far been associated with a lower labor share. We're looking only within the corporate sector because this actually helps really isolate the sort of employee versus employer, labor versus capital sort of distributional conflict in a way that looking at overall GDP sometimes doesn't. There are income flows within overall GDP where it's not super clear who they should be assigned to. For an example, like landlords, are they labor? Are they capital? They do a little bit of both. Another one, the biggest issue is proprietors of small businesses. Proprietors' income is definitely a mix of both capital owners and sort of managers. So there's definitely been a shift from wages to profits that has explained some of that missing income from the pay productivity graph. It turns out when we do later decompositions, we show it's been mostly about that within wage bill redistribution.
So I have a question, Josh.
Excellent.
So from ABDE0006, how do you respond to the argument asserting that the increasing productivity is due to technology and not workers' productivity?
I'd say a couple things. One, productivity growth sort of always and everywhere is a mix of a couple different things. One of the things is technology. Just because it's due to technological change doesn't mean that it's supposed to somehow bypass workers. Like I would show, let me go back. Oh, sorry. Go back a couple slides. It's a little hard to tell from the slope on the graph, but productivity growth was actually much more rapid before 1979 than after. And so any idea that somehow technological change has accelerated and that has been some reason why workers have been left behind, it's not true if you define, even if you just look at the portion of productivity growth that can be attributed to sort of disembodied technological change, which is a super problematic thing anyway. But sorry, scattered answer. I'd say this. I'd say, yes, technology contributes to productivity growth. It always has. The question is, how come productivity growth overall, whether technologically driven or by something else, accrues less to workers than it did before? I would argue technology was actually being pushed forward as quickly in the pre-1979 period as after. And even if it's technological change, it doesn't necessarily, gather from that. The question is who owns it? Who owns the right to benefit from that technological change? Who has the sort of power to claim it? And I think that's the big thing that's changed over this time period. And I think I'll have a couple data points that will shed some light on that as we go. The traditional narrative for why we've seen changes in inequality like this has basically been the race between education and technology. And the general idea is that as technology proceeds, that increases the demand for workers skilled in using technology. And the supply of workers who are skilled in using that kind of technology can be proxied by the education credentials of the workforce. And so, there's a very famous book by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz called The Race Between Education and Technology, where they try to estimate growth in labor demand, labor supply, labor demand for college-educated workers versus non-college, and see if that maps well, that sort of change in demand and supply, on the patterns of wage inequality that we've seen over the past generation. And our view is they don't map that well. And basically, right here, what we have is sort of the college wage premium by gender over the past, more than 50 years. And the college wage premium is basically the extra return you get on your wages from having a college degree holding all other characteristics constant. It is, in some sense, an attempt to isolate the economic value of the college degree. And you can see from this line, there's a time, like say before 1995, where this sort of race between education and technology seemed more plausible. If you look before 1995 on this graph, that's a pretty steep upward sloping line. The sort of return to having the college wage premium was clearly rising. And so maybe this rise in inequality really was a story about a rise in the college premium, this sort of race between education and technology. Look, since 1995, or especially since 2000, these lines flatten out a lot. There's been very little growth in the college wage premium since that time period. And yet, as we see from here, wage inequality after that period still rose very quickly, in fact, even more quickly than in the previous one. And so what we have here is basically, instead of having to eyeball the slopes of those previous two lines, we're just calculating sort of the average annual change in one measure of wage inequality, the log 95 to 50 ratio. This is sort of the wage of the person at the 95th percentile versus the wage of the person right in the middle of the wage distribution. That ratio was rising by about 0.76% annually from 79 to 2000. That actually accelerates after 2000. In the early period, the college wage premium was also rising really quickly. That's that steep part of the line we were showing before. But in the later period, the past 20 years, even as wage inequality has risen even faster, just looking at the college wage premium, that has actually just collapsed. Its growth has collapsed. It is very much flatlined. And so, if it's not a rising return to college since 2000, and yet we do have really rapid rising wage inequality since then, it seems very hard to say that the college wage premium is sort of the issue here. And so the simple sort of race between technology and education doesn't seem to explain what's going on. These two charts are very hard to see. They're basically an advertisement for a paper some colleagues have written, sort of really digging into the issue about whether or not we can find any evidence that technological changes and the associated rising demand for skills has been a real driver of trends in wage inequality. And so what we have here on the sort of horizontal axis, we've got every dot is an occupation, and the occupation is basically lined up by skill percentiles, the share of people in the occupation who have an advanced degree or a college degree. And so they're sort of lined up from the ones with the smallest education demands to the highest. And then the horizontal axis shows how much those occupations have changed in employment. The vertical axis shows how much those occupations have changed in pay. If what you have is just a simple shift in the demand curve for more skilled occupations, you should see the skilled occupations see more employment and higher wages. And in both these time periods, you don't see that at all. You just see a cloud. And so the way I would say it is you've got some occupations that have seen almost no employment growth, but huge wage growth. Think finance professionals. You've got some occupations that have seen huge employment growth, but like no wage growth. Think janitors, security guards, home health aides. And basically, you just have no systematic relationship between employment and wages, but you really should have a systematic relationship between employment and wages if you're telling a story that is just technology shifting out the relative demand for sort of more skilled workers. And then here, this is just my point from before about most measures of labor productivity, investment, and even investment in information technology actually have been slowing pretty substantially over time. And if you look at the last business cycle between 2007, these data end in 2016, it doesn't change much. The last business cycle that, sort of began in 2007, the last one before the COVID business cycle, you see really anemic rates of productivity growth, capital investment, hardware investment, software, like the story that technology is accelerating in a way that is, providing an explanation for slower wage growth. It doesn't really seem to bear out in this data. We seem to have slower and slower technological change over time, which is something that I think lots of people have trouble believing or wrapping their hands around. Like, I think whatever period of time you're walking through at the moment, technology feels like it's accelerating really quickly. But just to remind, some of the younger people in the audience, like this business cycle, the last business cycle before COVID started in 2007. It was a pretty long one. 2007 is when the iPhone was invented. And the idea that so technology is always running really quickly. And it was running quickly in the 35 years after World War II, as we sort of had mass electrification and the invention of the sort of automobile and things like that. So to the degree we can measure the pace of technological change and map it onto changes in wages, there just seems to be very little direct evidence that that is the thing that's driving all of this. So moving into sort of the real meat of the paper, there's a bunch of labor market puzzles that are only puzzles if you're really wedded to a competitive model of the labor market where you've got a well-defined demand for labor and supply. And I just list a bunch of them right here. I think the one that really stands out that is the real challenge is, very modest employment impacts of even quite substantial minimum wage increases. Like, if you believe the textbook model of competitive labor markets, minimum wages should noticeably cause job loss among the low-wage workforce. And it is one of the most well-studied things in economics. And the fact that minimum wages are purely exogenous political things dropped on labor markets from above, they're a really good test. Like, we should be able to detect any sort of employment impact they're having, and yet we don't. And to my mind, that's just a really the most stark example of sort of a labor market puzzle. That's only a puzzle if you think about the world in a sort of competitive labor market model, but less so if you've got a sort of a richer vision. And if people are interested, we can maybe return to some of these. But and so our view, like if you don't think wages and employment are determined in a competitive labor market with sort of well-defined labor supply and demand curves, and instead you think there's much more a story about the relative bargaining power of employers versus employees that determine these things, you can get pretty far in explaining a lot of things. And I think one of the things that's underrated that you can explain, or at least have something to say, is what people call, I've been talking about the big rise in inequality that has happened post 1979. There is also a huge decline in inequality that happened in the run-up to World War II and for the 30 years after. This is something economists call the Great Compression. Basically, things got much more equal over like a 10 to 15 year period and stayed more equal for a long time. And so in this graph, it's basically the blue line. This is the share of income going to the top 10%. And you can see at some point in the early 1940s, this drops enormously. And then it stays at a pretty low level for about 30 years. And then you see it rising back. And then just to give sort of one preview of where we're going, it really mirrors the rise and fall of collective bargaining in the United States. And so it's really hard to argue that like either technology collapsed or we didn't need skilled workers for some reason for some 30-year period of time. And that's what caused the Great Compression. Whereas instead, if you look at the rise and fall of labor market institutions and policies that determine bargaining power, maybe you can get a little further. And so from here, I'm just going to sort of march through what we think are the real important determinants of sort of workers' bargaining power and what has driven sort of the disappointing wage growth over the past generation. And so the first one I just sort of call the role of austerity macroeconomics, basically a shift in economic policymaking toward making sure inflation is kept very low, always and everywhere, even at the cost of tolerating excess unemployment. And so this graph, we just have sort of an estimate from the Congressional Budget Office of the natural rate of unemployment. This is the unemployment rate below which you're supposed to see some acceleration in inflation. I think it's probably a too conservative measure, but who cares? We'll just take it and we'll judge based on that. That's the light blue line, the NIRU, that's the natural rate. The dark blue line is actual unemployment. And it's a little tough to see, but if you look from 1979 to the left, you'll notice that actual unemployment spends a lot of time below the natural rate. And if you look after 1979, it spends much more time above. If you sort of add it all up cumulatively, even before the Great Recession that began in 2007, basically before 1979, cumulatively, actual unemployment was about 15 percentage points below the NIRU over that time period. After 1979 to 2007 was about 15 percentage points above. So just a big swing in how sort of aggressive policymakers were in keeping unemployment at or even below the natural rate. And then of course the Great Recession came and we spent 10 years well above it.
Sorry to interrupt again. I know that Firar has asked me to find questions at the end, but these are like two pressing questions that pertain to the last two pictures. So I'm just gonna go.
Yeah,
so there's one about union membership. If you think that that is a proxy for broader attitudes in societies that end up in a variety of policies, or do you think it's mostly about unions? That's one question. And the other question is about the validity of the data immediately after World War II. In particular, the fact that many texts show decline in the top 1% share post 1940 up until 73 or so. But what is your source of data after World War II, and how much grain of salt is needed there? Thank you, Josh. Sorry about it.
No worries. On the second one, I will definitely circle back to. Yes, the first question that arises with unions is, was it really a policy change or was it just something else, something inevitable? I argue strongly it was an intentional policy change. I'll hopefully provide some evidence on that. Income share, it's basically the Piketty and Saez data, which I would say to the degree people argue about sort of income share data for the United States, I don't feel like there's much argument about the Great Compression. I feel like it's much more after, and it's about, was it a 10 percentage point increase in the top 1% share or a 4 to 5% increase? And those are interesting. But pretty much every data set, whether it's the taxable income or whether it's the full distributional accounts, you see this great compression after World War II. So I think I'm happy to talk more about it, but this one I think I'm pretty confident in the decline after World War II. And this again is the top 10%, not the top one. So just to quickly just give one note on the importance of low unemployment for generating wage growth. The wage growth for the bottom 80% has not been zero since 1979, but it's been pretty small. One striking thing is almost all the wage growth happened in one period of time where unemployment actually was allowed to drift to about 4% for a couple of years. It was the late 1990s. And this graph just shows wage growth for the 20th percentile, the median, and the 95th percentile, basically for two periods. One is the late 1990s sort of tight labor markets. The other is all other post-1979 years. And this one only runs through 2017. 2018 and 2019 were okay years for wage growth, but the point I think still mostly stands. Basically, wage growth was strong across the board in the late 1990s when unemployment was allowed to drift very low, and it was essentially zero in all other years for the median and below. And so to me, this is just a testament to the importance of sort of keeping the macro environment too slack over that time period. And again, even if you try to directly estimate in a regression the responsiveness of wages at the 10th, 50th, and 90th to a change in unemployment, the 10th and the 50th percentile wage is much more sensitive to the unemployment rate. And so it all works in terms of the patterns in the data showing that tight labor markets are not just good for wage growth across the board, they're also wage compressing. So this is the role of deunionization that we talked about. And this is a graph from Fortin, Lemieux, and Lloyd in a really excellent paper they did. And just if you read this, just focus for now on sort of the results for men. On the horizontal axis, this is percentiles of income. So going from the 10th percentile to the 20th, all the way to the top. So this is wages getting higher as you go from left to right. And this is the effect of this is the union premium, how much being in a union increases your wages. And you can basically see for workers between like the 20th percentile and the 70th, there is a substantial union premium. Union premium actually looks to be a little negative for very high wage workers. And so again, this means that unions are highly wage equalizing. And so this is just the importance of unions. And again, this is just sort of breaking it down, the effect of a 10% increase in the unionization rate on men and women. Basically at the median for men, it's about a 6% increase if you see a 10% increase in the unionization rate. Given that we've seen about a 20% decline in unionization over the sort of full 1979 period, kind of double this for the effect on wages. So unions are highly equalizing within the wage structure. And that's just another summary of that. Okay, another thing we identify in the paper as sort of a policy change that has been important has been the rise in trade flows in the US from clearly poorer countries. And basically this is just US manufacturing imports as a share of GDP from an earlier paper I wrote. And we have total, but then I think really importantly, imports from less developed countries. And it's been that latter category that has seen the really big increase. And this has been another thing that has been sort of a suppression of wage growth, especially for non-college workers in the US. So the three big factors we sort of identified so far are sort of, excessively austere macroeconomic policy, the role of deunionization, and globalization. And then there's been a range of other factors that we sort of, review the literature and try to assign a number to that are in the paper. The rise of non-compete agreements, something that once was something that really only applied to sort of very high wage workers, say in finance or sectors like that. Now you've got the anecdotal stories about fast food workers who actually have to sign non-compete agreements. And I think the latest numbers were something like probably between a quarter and a third of US workers had to sign a non-compete agreement at some point over the past 5 to 10 years. Another issue is labor market concentration. The sort of the flip side of monopoly is that as you get greater concentration in product markets, that almost by definition means you're going to see greater concentration in the labor market as well. I think another big issue is what has been called the fissuring of the labor market, which is sort of the rise of subcontracting, taking workers that were once part of the lead firm and subcontracting out their services, so they no longer are covered by sort of the same union or the same wage norms that prevailed in the larger firm. The classic example of this is cafeteria workers at colleges. So there may have been a time where the cafeteria workers at, say, Yale were actual employees of Yale University. And then they get subcontracted out to sort of cafeteria staffing firms. And that just makes organizing them and sort of drifting in the wake of whatever wage norms Yale might want to apply to its more privileged employees harder for them. And so fissuring has been a big issue. And then just monopoly power of dominant buyers, basically the fact that, firms like Walmart and Amazon, the primary way they seem to have leveraged their huge market power is not by charging their customers incredibly high prices. Instead, they leverage it backwards on the supplier firms and the workers in those firms and sort of keep costs low that way. And again, if you're not in the lead firm, you're facing intense pressure. And then just weaker labor standards enforcement, including things like overtime violations and wage theft. So basically, all of this is in the portfolio of policy changes that have been examined by researchers that we sort of highlight in the paper. And basically, we look at that sort of divergence between productivity and median hourly compensation. Well, yeah, we switched to median hourly compensation, but after 1979, we basically say we think there is about a 43 percentage point gap between economy-wide productivity and wage growth of typical workers that kind of needs to be explained. And if you look at the effect of excess unemployment, union erosion, and globalization, you basically get over half of that divergence just with those first three policies. When we add up what we think is sort of the literature's evidence on the other things, whether it's overtime, misclassification, fissuring, we get about another 20%. And so you can get to about 3/4 of the entire divergence between economy-wide productivity and real hourly compensation sort of explained by, discrete identifiable factors, just really shrinking the ground that is left to be explained by much harder to observe directly things like technology. And so that's just a figure version of this. And I'll just say two things. Maybe we can go back to the minimum wage if people care. I think the really important thing here, just because I'm getting near the sort of 45-minute mark, and I'd love to sort of reserve some time for some discussion, which has come up, is sort of the intentionality argument, or let me go to the union argument. So we would say they're kind of the same thing. I think, we can say the decline of unions was an intentional policy strategy to suppress workers' bargaining power. That's kind of my view of the world. But maybe just workers decided they didn't like unions. Or maybe as we shifted from manufacturing to a more service-oriented economy, unions are less relevant there. And you can sort of argue the same thing about macro policy. Maybe they weren't trying to hurt workers' wages. Maybe they just really were trying to sort of reduce the harms of inflation. I think in both of those, if you start to scratch the surface, you see pretty strong intentionality. Like on the macro part, I mean, just read the sort of histories of the Fed from the 1970s and 80s and how, say, Paul Volcker thought about what he was doing with the big interest rate increases that led to really high unemployment in the 1980s that really brought down inflation of that time. He really saw the way that was going to run was by reducing the bargaining power of workers. And he thought that was a good thing. And I would say since then, after coming out of the 80s, as we saw inflation start to decline, it wasn't like macro policymakers relented and allowed unemployment to drift back down to very low levels. It was kept very high for a long time, even in the face of falling inflation. And again, if you read sort of the minutes of the Fed during that time, it was really all about keeping wages quiescent, keeping labor markets soft enough so you didn't have any upward pressure. And then the phrase that was used at the Fed was sort of opportunistic disinflation. It was the idea that we have really sort of broken the back of bargaining power in the US economy, and that's actually a good thing because it makes inflation easier to manage. And in one sense, it does make inflation easier to manage, but the question then becomes, is that worth this cost of keeping unemployment excessively high? And given the incredibly depressing effect of high unemployment on wage growth, I think that cost benefit doesn't work out great. And the issue of unions, I think the best evidence for the fact that unions didn't just die a natural death of workers being uninterested in them anymore comes from some work that was started by Richard Freeman. Let's see. Oh, I don't have that one. Okay. Instead, I'll just go with that. If you look at some work started by Richard Freeman asking workers whether or not they would like to be in a union, basically you've got about 50% of non-union workers surveyed say they would like to be in a union. And in fact, that number has risen in the past 10 to 15 years, even as the unionization rate continues to fall. And so if you've got a preference for workers when they respond to survey takers that they would like to be represented by a sort of collective institution, and yet they're not, you start to think, well, something's keeping that from happening. What is the friction there? What is keeping workers who want to be in a union from being in it? And then if you look at, and this is a paper some colleagues of mine did examining NLRB, National Labor Relations Board elections over a 4-year period, and you see the immense resources brought to bear by employers to keep unions from forming in their workplaces. Basically more than 40% of all NLRB elections were found that the employer undertook an unfair labor practice, including firing organizers. And this is just what, this is not a super worker-friendly NLRB over this period of time. This is mostly during the Trump administration. And yet, even in this time period, they are finding 40% of employers are violating the law as they try to fight unionization in their workforce. Who knows how many people were fired and just never got its way to the NLRB process. We also have documented they spend, employers, about $500 million a year for the union avoidance industry. Yeah, and so we've got a bunch of data on just how much intentional effort is undertaken by employers to sort of make sure their employees don't organize. And there's a policy remedy to this. You could just increase the fines for unfair labor practices, which are pretty trivial today. You could make all sorts of other reforms to the election process that would make it harder for employers to meddle in it, and yet we don't. And yet we've never made those reforms. And so in my mind, sort of policy stasis in the face of clearly sort of growing employer hostility, I mean, that's a policy choice. And so I think it's a policy choice that has borne fruit for employers in the form of very low unionization rates. And then I think the final piece of evidence I'd point to on sort of, did unions die a natural death or were they killed by policy? Unionization has declined across most advanced economies relative to its peak, say in the 1960s or 70s. The decline is much more pronounced in the United States than any other economy. And so I can totally buy that we would not have had the same unionization rate we had in 1955, even if there had been a very good policy regime this whole time. But I think the sort of excess deunionization felt by the United States, which I think has a much more hostile policy apparatus to union organizing, is another big piece of the evidence. So I think from there, I'm basically going to wrap it up. I think the big issue is that economists for too long have been sort of looking for pretty apolitical reasons why we've seen these profound labor market changes, especially the incredibly slow wage growth for the bottom 80% over the past generation of economic life. And instead, I think, there's been a super welcome shift in the profession over the past 10 years to really emphasize the role of just market power that employers wield, whether it's monopsony power, whether it's other models of bargaining. It just seems to me you really have to think about much more sort of institutional policy-driven determinants of power in labor markets if you want to tell a convincing explanation for what has happened to wage growth over this time. And all we tried to do in this paper is document just adding up the numbers and what has been directly estimated attached to each of these discrete policy changes gets you a really far down the road in explaining the wage trends you see. And so that really should change how we think about determinants of wage growth in the US economy. And so I will wrap it up there, and I'm happy to do some questions.
So thank you very much.
Stop sharing.
So I'm going to start with a comment about the fact that the union membership decline looked a lot like the decline in manufacturing share of total employment, which might suggest that this is like the most, unionized sector in the economy. And then I'm going to sort of take advantage of my moderating privileges to sort of just to get started in the Q&A. So the one thing that I was thinking, you hinted at this, which is the kind of the now famous measurement problem, right, with the labor share. So you talked about the Rongley paper and the Gutierrez and Piton paper, right, that are now like really sort of more recent than famous Karabarbonis-Niemann. So I wanted to take your temperature on that, and then and partially related, there's this argument that has been made recently by Acemoglu and Restrepo about in the context of like task-based automation, right, and the fact that high wages might be fostering automating tasks, and so this might lead to either a negative effect, which they call the replacement effect, or positive effects on employment and income distribution. So I wanted to ask you that, and then I have so why don't you go ahead, and then I have some more questions coming in from the audience. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, on the labor share issue, I think basically to sidestep a lot of the trickier measurement issues, we look only within the corporate sector. I think I don't know, 95% of the controversy of the measurement is all about how to deal with income flows that are sort of those weird intermediate ones. If you only look within the corporate sector, all income is classified as either wages or profits. And so it lets you get a direct cut at that sort of employer distributional conflict. I think the other issues are super interesting. But if all we're trying to do in this paper is claim that there's been a shift in that two-way distributional conflict, and so that's why we do that. We feel like it's just the cleanest cut. On the Acemoglu Restrepo, yeah, I have a tough time. And so two things. One reason why we chose to do the paper we did, the way we did the paper we did, is exactly instead of going, how much does technology explain, which some people, some papers have it at 70%, some have it at 10. Instead, we went the other way. We're like, let's look at like the literature on deunionization, on slack labor market, and see if we can see how much ground we can take up even before we get to anything else. And so the fact that we can get to so much just from sort of clearly identifiable sort of policy measures, I think is sort of a strength in what we're doing. I just don't think there's that much left to explain once you account for the things we have. And so to me, the Acemoglu Restrepo, it's a little hard to disentangle from the other sort of skill bias technological change arguments that I think are pretty, I mean, nothing's ever debunked, but I think those scatter plots on the occupational employment and wage changes ranked by sort of skill level, that's really compelling to me. Like if you're going to tell a story that high wage people are high wage because they're high credential, high skill, and these are just competitive labor markets doing what they do, I just want to see a co-movement between employment and wages, and you just don't see it in those.
All right, so thank you. So there's a question from the audience. Given the degree of capital mobility, both between states and with other countries, what do you think are the prospects for restoring labor's bargaining power?
I think I think it's going to be a tough road, and I totally agree. I think we're never going to get, we shouldn't try because there's nothing optimal about the 1960s labor market. There were all sorts of inequalities that were terrible. But I do think just sort of strictly in restoring balance between the employer-employee distributional conflict, it's going to be really hard. But I think there's a number of things we can do. I think on the macro policy one, I think there's some real progress being made. Like I think we have a very different Federal Reserve now than we did in 1990. And I think you see it in their behavior most starkly before COVID. Like since COVID, everything has been crazy. But in 2019, with unemployment below 4%, the Federal Reserve actually cut interest rates. That was sort of astonishing and a very welcome change. So I think on that front, I'm actually kind of an optimist. I think there's just been a widespread recognition that labor markets can be ratcheted up much tighter than they were allowed to be for big chunks in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. I think on the minimum wage side, we didn't talk much about minimum wage. I think on other labor standards, the minimum wage, like at the federal level, it's super depressing. It's still $7.25. It's been $7.25 for a very long time. Most US workers are covered by a substantially higher minimum wage than that, though, because states have moved ahead quite aggressively. And so I think that's a mix of good news and bad news. I would say finally on the unionization front, which I think is absolutely key, who knows? That there are some provisions in the Build Back Better Act that actually would increase fines for some of the really egregious forms of kind of union busting that I was talking about earlier. There's other labor law reforms that I think have to go a lot broader that I wouldn't bet my house are going to happen, but I feel like at least they're on the policy radar in a way that they weren't 5 to 6 years ago. So I am not an optimistic person by nature, but I'm also not in complete despair that we can't do anything about this.
And I have another question from the audience about worker cooperatives. What do you think? What do you think of that?
I'm intrigued. I am skeptical is not even the word because I'm too ignorant to be skeptical. Or I worry about the scaling problem. Like, to me, worker cooperatives could work excellently if there was a lot of intrinsic motivation. Like, you could imagine like a nonprofit with a mission would be a great candidate for being a worker cooperative because people would work hard because they believed in the mission. Or if you had, a bunch of people who were just really diehard, beer brewers and really interested in that but as a sort of, lots of people have jobs that they don't really intrinsically have a ton of interest in. They want the paycheck. And motivation and managing groups like that, worker cooperatives, it's not obvious that that's a great way for that to happen. So I would love to see a larger niche carved out for them in the US economy. I don't think they're going to be move the dial at a macro level. I could be totally wrong. I'm a not imaginative person.
Thanks. So I wanted to I have kind of the question coming from a person that builds models all the time. So there's two things, when you, especially labor markets models, like one thing is labor bargaining power, right? And the other thing is when we talk about minimum wage and unemployment compensations, and these kind of things are fallback positions for workers, right? So what do you think? So first of all, do you think that the distinction is useful? How is it relevant for your analysis?
Sorry, what's the distinction between
the actual bargaining power, which could be maybe unionization rate or like the share going to workers and so on, and these policy measures especially that have to do with lifting the floor, right? So unemployment benefits or minimum wages and so on.
Yeah, in my mind, they're kind of all of a piece. I think what you said I really like is how I think about it in terms of anything that improves workers' sort of fallback position when they're bargaining with an employer is something that is going to be good for wage growth. That to me is why tight labor markets work so well. Like it's just not credible to tell your employer I need a raise or I'll quit when unemployment's 8%. It becomes much more credible when labor markets are much tighter. I'm super intrigued by we've seen some pockets of really rapid wage growth very recently, because the pandemic shut down and restarting leisure and hospitality and all of that. And I'm a little intrigued by how much of that might be because of the fiscal relief we did between the economic impact payments and then the radically increased unemployment insurance benefits, at least until September of this year, gave many people sort of a liquid savings buffer that they never had before, and made them less desperate to take the first job available, or gave them, I've got a couple weeks saved up so I can quit this truly horrible job. And so I think I've always been a little bit of a skeptic of UBI proposals, because I was sort of like, well, if they're big enough to really matter for people, they're incredibly expensive, and maybe we're going to use those fiscal resources in a more targeted way. I'm now starting to think, could even a very, very small UBI provide enough of a liquid buffer that it would really beef up bargaining power for workers? And so that's so I think all those things are of a piece, but I think the general view that increasing the fallback position of workers when they're bargaining with employers is really the right way to think about it. And I definitely think like enhanced unemployment insurance compensation could be a really big part of that. Sorry, that was a little scattered.
No, that's great. So I had another question about co-determination, for instance, like putting workers on corporate boards, and like, do you think that they could have a similar effect to rising unionization, basically?
It's a really good question. I'm a big fan. I think it'd be a great thing. I usually am a big fan of that in the context of like a different debate over like how to restrain excessive CEO pay. And I think sort of co-determination and like there's just been research that unionized firms do a better job restraining CEO pay than others. And so if you put workers on the boards directly, it seems like that's got to work better. I think, I don't think it's a substitute for unionization. I think it's sort of a complement to it. And I also think there's like, just as a political reality, we're never going to have co-determination unless we have a strong enough labor movement to like put it on the political agenda. And so every now and then I feel like people act like it's an end run around the need to restore unions more broadly. And I just don't think it's going to be that, but I definitely think it would be a really useful thing to do for the US economy generally.
Thank you. So I have a question about tax policy, and income distribution, and a follow-up question by the same person about social norms. I might like to ask them to expand, but yeah, please go ahead. Tax policies and income distribution.
Yeah. I would say, so tax policy is obviously hugely important, and this is going to be the more trivial statement, in explaining post-tax inequality. I mean, I think one thing that characterizes the US rise in inequality, it's been almost all pre-tax and transfer has been the driver of it. Like the fiscal system in the US is equality enhancing. So like post-tax and transfer inequality is lower than pre-tax, but it hasn't become any more so over the past 35 or 40 years. Basically, it has held steady while pre-tax and transfer inequality has just exploded. I'm super intrigued by like the Piketty-Saez-Stancheva argument that very high marginal tax rates reduce the incentive of really well-placed actors like CEOs to bargain harder and take more of the surplus and have an effect on pre-tax inequality that way. But I think I think the changes we've seen since 1979 are mostly happening at the pre-tax level and are not mostly driven by changes in tax rates. So I want more income and a better life for the bottom 80%. And to the degree we can deliver some of that with the fiscal system, that's fantastic. I do think eventually for real equality, we're going to have to iron out the bargaining power differences even before the fiscal system gets involved. Oh, and the social norms question is slightly interesting as well, just because it dovetails with the tax rate issue. I think social norms and policies, they just reinforce each other a lot. Like I think there was a time when marginal tax rates were really high, when it really did not make a lot of sense for CEOs to try to pay themselves like $20 million because the top marginal tax rate was 90%. And to get $20 million, they'd have had to outrage a bunch of people and really bargain hard with their workers and be unpopular. And then they don't get to keep it. So what's the point? And so they may have told themselves there was a social norm against taking all the money out of the company. But in fact, it was mostly about the tax rates. And so I think social norms are definitely important. And I think they're just tied up with policy parameters in a way that's, I don't know how to untangle. And well, I would be happy. I'd be happy to have my email address distributed if people want to get in touch. So
one of the reasons why I asked this question about bargaining power versus fallback positions and things like that, it was directly tied up to the minimum wage results by Cengiz, Dubé, and others, right? Like the fact that, so there seemed to be like little effects on employment by these like sort of lifting the floor fallback measures. And so the question is, the other side, workers' power. I understand that you think that these fallback and worker power are kind of tied up. But what do you think? What do you see the effects on, say, rising worker power on EPOP, for instance, like big measures of employment and unemployment?
I think they're pretty. My sense is that the association between the two is actually pretty weak, and that's kind of good news in the sense. And it's sort of related to my point about if you think a lot of the rise in inequality coming from the labor market is kind of the redistribution of rents. Then you've got big changes in income flows and wages without much change at all in allocative efficiency or on the employment side. And so I think, I think the standard view would say anytime you raise wages, you're making a trade-off, you're going to have less employment somewhere. And I think if you think these are rents shifted around, you don't face that trade-off. And so, I think it's even an Alan Krueger speech, which again, I cannot recommend it. It did not get near the attention it should have, given how, famous and great he was and how good the topic was. But he basically says exactly that, at the same time, you've had this huge decline in sort of workers' bargaining power. You don't see a big explosion in sort of prime age employment. Like, it's not like we sort of had shut people out of the labor market by having reservation wages too high, and then we brought them in. Like, in fact, it's been largely, untouched. And so, yeah, I think that there's a separation between like distribution and allocation, and in a sense that, that can be good news for people who want progressive policies.
Thank you so much. So I really appreciate your time, Josh. It's always good to see you. I hope to get to see you again in person sometime reasonably soon. I wanted to also thank the Center for Peace and Development at the University of Oklahoma and Security in Context at Hampshire College for co-sponsoring this event. And with this, I wish everybody in the audience a happy weekend and be safe. Thank you.